welcome to Ilsley Public Library. I am Renee Ursitti, the Adult Services Librarian. I mostly do programming here, but I really do a little bit of everything. You're here tonight for the first in-person First Wednesdays that we've had in a year. We thank John for braving the pandemic and joining us in person. John R. Killacky is here to talk to you a program called A Life in Art and Activism. John currently serves in the Vermont House of Representatives. Previously, he was the Executive Director of Flynn Center for Performing Arts, Program Officer for Arts and Culture for the San Francisco Foundation, Executive Director of Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and Curator of Performing Arts for Walker Arts Center. So he certainly knows what he's talking about. And I'm very excited to hear what he has to say, just looking at the pictures he's going to share with you. I can't wait to hear his stories and his life. Some sponsors I'd like to thank. First and foremost, the Friends of the Ilsley Public Library, who tirelessly raise money through book sales to support all the programs. They pay for all the programs that we do, both for adults and children. In the last 10 years, they've raised over $75,000 for this library. So it's a wonderful organization, and if you're interested, you can find out more on our website. Other sponsors, statewide sponsors for this wonderful First Wednesday series are the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are going to do December's in person here again, hoping to get back into everybody's routine. And if you want to talk, join us next month. It's From Little Jerusalem to the Lost Mural, Preserving Jewish and Immigrant Heritage with archivists Aaron Goldberg and Jeff Potash. So now I'm going to turn it over to the Vermont Humanities, and then we'll hear John.
Hello, everybody. I don't have very much to add. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Christopher Kaufman Ilstrup. I am the Director of Vermont Humanities and a longtime friend of John Killacky's since he moved to Vermont. I'm honored to have him be part of the First Wednesday series and thankful for your participation, and glad to be beginning the process of coming back together in person. We are a small but mighty group this evening, and hopefully more people will see this in the recording that will be available on our website sometime in the next few weeks. We'll turn it over to John. Thank you so much for being here, John. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me to your library, and thank you, Christopher and the Humanities Council. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm among friends, and so I'm very touched that you all came tonight. So thank you for that very much. When I talked to Christopher about that I was having a book coming out this fall, he said, well, you know, would you like to do some of these things at First Wednesdays? And I love First Wednesdays. And so, of course, I had to come up with a title in the summer, and we called it A Life in Art and Activism. And then as I was putting this talk together, I thought, I wonder what I meant back then in the summer about this. But it was interesting. My niece was married by the Catholic priest who was in my high school. And I hadn't seen this priest in 50 years. Mm. And when after the marriage ceremony, we sat down and he said, I've wanted for 50 years to apologize to you. And I said, okay, Father Ruby, about what? And he said, you were quite something when you were the editor of the high school newspaper, and you actually got suspended each time. And I said, yes. And he said, and then when you invited the SDS speaker to our school, this was 1969, so Students for Democratic Society were a little radical for an Irish Catholic neighborhood in Chicago. He said, I had to tell you no. And he said, I waited 50 years to tell you that you were right and I was wrong. So I guess I was political back then, but it was the time. It was 1968, 69. Everything was happening. I mean, the Chicago Convention, Democratic Convention was 68. Remember, that's when Martin Luther King had been murdered, Bobby Kennedy had been murdered. It was a very contentious Democratic Convention. I was down there, of course, my little teenage self, and in the police riot, I came home and I was pretty bloodied from it all. And my parents were watching television and were like, "Look at what those kids are doing." And I say, wait, look at me. The cops did this, the kids didn't do it. Also, so that's a little bit of the activism. But that's my 20-year-old self there on the screen. And what had happened is my father sold cattle to the Chicago stockyards. So we were not a cultured family. You know, Ed Sullivan on Sunday nights is what we had for culture, period. But in high school, I went to a trip in Chicago with my school to see the Alvin Ailey Dance Company. And it blew my mind. Never seen anything like it. And I remember looking at that stage and thinking, whatever that is, I want. So that night after I went home, and the 5 kids and my mom and dad, we were all having dinner, and I announced very grandly that I was going to be a modern dancer. And, you know, my father, so what's that? So anyway, my mother got out the yellow pages and looked up modern dance, and drove me that Saturday downtown Chicago. And for an effeminate young boy to find something in the world that I could embody and feel whole and feel special and safe. And so dance became very important to me. At the age of 20, I was invited to the Harkness Ballet in New York to study, and this was 1973, and so that's me in 1973. But if you think about New York in 1973, Stonewall had just happened in 1969, so there was a whole gay liberation movement was happening. Dance was, postmodernism was happening, so the classical forms of dance were being deconstructed and changed. And it was at that moment that I came into my adulthood, and it was incredible to be dancing and being around postmodernists and being in punk bars and also, you know, a kind of a new queer identity. But, you know, in the 70s New York, if you were gay, you couldn't be a teacher. You didn't have any rent protection. You could be thrown out. There was no, if you were beaten on the street, the cops didn't come to help. So it was a very different time. Same-sex activity wasn't decriminalized in New York till 1980. So, you know, in our lifetime, we've seen so much change happen back then. So, you know, it made sense for me to integrate all of these different parts. So if we go to the next photo, please. I was cast in a play called Coming Out, which I think was, I was told, it was the first gay history play. And no, next, no, keep going that way, there, that one. And so that's me trying to be an actor. I wasn't a very good actor, but it was fun. But I remember my friends from the ballet world, when they'd come to see this, they'd say, "Well, is this art or is this politics?" And it's like, what's the difference? You know, why can't a gay history play be art? And I was trying really hard to be an actor, you know, but there was this interesting thing that even in the abstract dance world, you couldn't be political. But it was like, no, that didn't work. So I then, I danced a lot for over 10 years in Winnipeg, Canada, and the Gene Erdman Dance Company, and then I found my way into kind of arts administration with Laura Dean and Tricia Brown. And I think about that sort of, that brings us up into the 80s, and then at the end of the 80s in New York, people began to get sick, and AIDS started happening. But it wasn't a disease that people understood. It was a disease that people feared, and you know, families rejected people, hospitals rejected people. No one knew what to do. The politicians certainly rejected people, and this art world that I was in at that time, ACT UP happened, and there was a lot of artists involved in the trying to respond on street actions. And there were a lot of visual artists that were doing it. It was kind of amazing to look at. And in the book, I profile some of them. There was Keith Haring, Peter Hujar, the photographer, Douglas Grimp, the art historian. Sarah Schulman just has a new book out called Act Up, and she talks about the early years of it. It's a great book. Donna Ann McAdams, a photographer who lives in Vermont, she was in the middle of photographing all of those amazing actions that were happening. Tim Miller, Bill T. Jones, Tony Kushner, they're all in the book, and all of these artists were really fine artists, but they also were political at the same time. And then, if we could go to the next slide, in 1988, I moved to the Walker Art Center, where I was the curator of performing arts. So in this, no, it's it's the right one. That's right. That's Karen Finley. And in 1990, because it was the beginning of the decade, I put together a series called Cultural Infidels. And because I thought, here we're going to be the new decade, and we're going to showcase the emerging artists who are coming up, and many of them were in this aesthetic, political, and many of them had lost people from AIDS, so there was a lot of body issues and making the body sacred again, and it was very scary. And so Karen had never been to the Walker before, and so she was performing for 3 nights. The first night, she's there, and it was sold out, which is great. And the box office calls me over and said, John, these 2 guys want to talk to you. I was like, great, okay. And so I went over there, and they said, well, we would like to see the performance. And I said, well, I'm sorry, it's sold out. Maybe you can come tomorrow or the next night. And they said, no, we're from the police department. And I said, no, it's sold out. And I said, you'd have to sit on this stairs, and that, as you know, that blocks access, so that won't work. They said, no, we're the Vice Squad. I said, the Vice Squad? What does that mean? I didn't even know Minneapolis had a Vice Squad. They said, well, we've had a complaint that you have a pornographic act tonight. And I said, well, this woman's never performed here. How could someone complain? Well, we hear she's nude. And I said, well, this is a museum. There's new paintings, new sculptures, there's new films. What nudity isn't a problem. And they said, well, no, we've come here to check it. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we're going to close it down if it's pornographic. And so I said, okay, this seems a little crazy to me, come on in. And so they came in, and they saw this very cathartic, visceral rage that this woman had about what was happening and about her claiming her own body. It's very powerful work. And midway through, you know, I was standing in the back of the hall. I sort of watched them sit on the stairs, but they looked at each other, and I guess, of course, they realized there was nothing pornographic. But what was interesting, it was just the image of someone who was naked scared somebody, and they complained. And it began an assault against artists from the National Endowment for the Arts. That year, Senator Jesse Helms denied grants to Karen Finley, to Tim Miller, to John Fleck, and to Holly Hughes. 3 of the 4 happened to be queer, so there was a little homophobia in that, but they were all dealing with body issues. And Senator Helms, who's conservative, decided that people shouldn't be nude and talking and doing this. So they were denied grants. Then anyone who got a grant was told they had to sign a decency amendment. And so the directors I worked for, she said, well, what are you going to do? I said, we're signing it. We don't do anything indecent. So, you know, so it became an assault against these artists that were doing body stuff. At this time, I'm going to, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to read. I also, we're now 1993, so we're further along into this pandemic, and the amount of losses that we had, personal and in the arts community, were pretty profound. And coming from a gay man who'd been in New York, I was losing lots of friends, and I really had no idea how to cope. And so I began writing pieces in op-ed pieces. I began making films about it really as a way to survive myself. And so this is a voiceover for one of my films, and it's in the book, and I'll just read it to you. Late night phone calls still frighten me. Years ago, my neighbor Charlie would call in the middle of the night, screaming through his dementia for help, begging us to get him out of the hospital, away from his real and imagined demons. I wouldn't answer the phone. I could only listen to his voice coming through the answering machine, silent and paralyzed with fear. I thought there was nothing I could do. I never did visit him in that hospital. I was too ashamed. He never came home again. I remember holding Peter, trying to warm his shivering body, hoping that somehow I could heal him, even for a short while, so he could sleep. Both of us were drenched in his night sweats. He kept apologizing as he cried. I wept too, but my tears were filled with rage. Earlier that day, we had spent hours waiting in lines, filling out forms that enabled him to get medications. He had no health insurance, and each stop demanded that he be present to sign the proper forms. So he sat exhausted and consumed by his fevers, while I held his place in line. Months later, I dreamt of him and called, only to speak to his daddy. Peter had died that morning in Michael's arms, as his mama urged him to go on. I called my friend Lee at home to see how he was feeling. I just returned from an extended business trip and wanted to reestablish contact. His sister answered the phone, thanked me for calling, and asked if I wanted to share something with those gathered in the apartment for his memorial service. Selfishly, I felt cheated. I wouldn't have any private closure with him. Weeks afterward, I called his disconnected number, hoping we could talk one last time. Months later, I called his phone number again, explaining to the newly connected household how special he had been. When the call came ending Kevin's death watch, I was relieved. 3 weeks prior, the doctors had stopped his feeding, upped the morphine, and said he would go in 48 hours. But they didn't know that Kevin and I did. We were lovers a decade ago. We trained together, made love, and dreamt our dreams together. Upon hearing the news, I thought at least I wouldn't have to call the hospital anymore. In his last month, with the morphine obliterating all feeling, I would call and be continually told his condition was satisfactory. 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 Most recently, I cried with my friend Margie over the death of her brother Christopher. Margie told me of crawling into Christopher's deathbed to hold him. As his spirit began to leave, instead of releasing, his body contracted as only a dancer could and tightly embraced her. She held on, knowing that he was going, leaving her with the unfinished legacies of all those prematurely lost. He had chosen to die peacefully, with great clarity, letting Margie know that his work was now done, but hers and ours only begun. They're all gone now, 96 of my angels. For too many of them, I didn't get to say goodbye. I still need to somehow resolve the forlorn reality of their death. The impact of the grief and the mourning of each new loss remains as intense as the first. Oftentimes, late at night, it's hard for me to breathe, as I cry for all the devastation amongst us. Heroes, all of them. So needlessly lost, I'm truly blessed to have been touched by them all, to have been loved by angels. For all of us that have gone before, and for those that remain, may there be passionate, unforgiven fire. I went on and made 2 other AIDS films, and it's been great. They're around the world, and in libraries and museums. Let's go to the next slide. So back at my day job, this is an artist by the name of Athey. And Ron was someone I presented in 1994. And Ron came from Los Angeles, and Ron's backstory is, as a child, he was a Pentecostal preacher. As an 8-year-old, he was put in the tent shows, and he could speak in tongues, and he could dance and stuff, and so he became part of the circuit. Well, as a teenager, he became a junkie, and he fell out of his Pentecostal roots, and had a very hard life. His mother and his aunt were schizophrenic, and he had a very chaotic life. But he then moved into the punk scene and actually beat his addiction. And so he started making these really drastic works about pain and suffering and transcendence. And so this picture I'm showing you here is, if you look at it closely, it's really his takeoff on Saint Sebastian. It's a Christian thing, and he's pierced as Saint Sebastian is, but on stage he's pierced, and so a needle goes in, and it's kind of startling when you see this in person. But his pieces really were about redemption and power, and so I presented this work at the Walker Art Center, and the critics had been invited, and none of them came. But 3 weeks afterwards, the visual art critic called me, and she said, "What did you present? I can't believe what I've heard." And I said, "What did you hear?" And she started describing, I said, "Well, that didn't happen." And she said, "Well, you better look for my article on the front page of the paper tomorrow." And it was, let's see, "Knife-wielding performer is known to be HIV positive, and the audience knocked over the chairs to get out from underneath the blood-soaked clotheslines." Well, 100 people were there. No one ran out. 80 people stayed for the post-conversation with the artist because they were really interested in, like, okay, he's out there. Well, just as the Karen Finley thing kind of propelled, Athey became the thing of the summer, and Donald Wildman from the American Family Association. Now, this is 1994, so there wasn't the internet. Maybe that was a good thing. But Mr. Wildman gave out my home address and phone number to his 18,000 followers, because he was trying to raise money against this. He was a very conservative preacher, American Family Association, the name of his organization. And I got so much hate mail, again, about things that people hadn't seen. And then they started calling me. And it was like, one call said, "We got the abortion doctor, you're next." And I was in Minnesota at the time. In Wisconsin, there was a doctor who was murdered outside of an abortion clinic. And so it was weird to kind of look out your window before you left to see if someone was sitting in a car with a gun. And the police would do drive-bys by my house every half hour, all for an artist that no one had seen. It was kind of like, what's going on here? People. And I think the best was, and it's kind of telling about the power of media, is when my mother called me. And she said, "What did you do?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Rush Limbaugh was yelling about you on television last night." I said, because he had a cable show before he had the radio stuff. And, and I said, "Mom, who are you going to believe, Rush Limbaugh or your son? He's a clown, he's lying for, ratings." And she said, "But John, it was on television." Anyway, so Mr. Athey was demonized, and actually, this is 1994, he stopped working in America because it was so hard. No one else would present it because it just seemed like it was going to be too hard. So he moved to Europe. But I did have a museum in New York brought him back 20 years later and asked me if I would do a post-show conversation with him. So now he's welcome back to America. It took 20 years. So I'm going to shift now, and a year later, after Ron had formed, I found a tumor inside my spinal cord. And so I was scheduled for surgery, and the doctor said, oh, well, it was up high at C2, where the tumor was, but it was inside the cord, so they couldn't do a biopsy, but it was blocking about 60% of the cord. So they said, you know, we should have surgery, and you'll be in the hospital 3 or 4 days, and sore neck for a month. So okay, let's do it. And well, it didn't work out so well, as you all know, because you know me, but I woke up completely quadriplegic. And clearly it had gone wrong in surgery, not what people had expected. What was interesting for me is that I felt really lucky that I had been an artist and I knew artists, because it took about 2 weeks, but I was able to move this one finger pretty much. That's it. And so they'd get me out of bed every day, and they wheeled me into like occupational therapy, where I was like sitting with other people, and I was completely freaked out by this. And they like wanted to move screws or something with my finger, and I just thought, I said, how about taking me to the computer lab? I said, why? And I said, well, I can move one finger. Instead of moving a screw, maybe I could type something. So I would spend literally the whole day thinking about what I wanted to type. And it was, I couldn't write any notes down because I couldn't do that. But every day I knew I had a half hour, and I would just, and it was, you know, a lot of it wasn't very good, or sometimes wasn't much at all. But I felt like it was a way to claim something. And then about 4 weeks later, this progressed, the finger and the hand, this side, and then they would pick me up out of the bed, 2 people would, and lift me into the wheelchair, and then I would go off to physical therapy or occupational therapy. I still couldn't stand up. But I realized that somehow people would lift me up. That somehow I thought I could stand up, but I didn't have any sensation in my legs. I still don't. But I said to them, I said, you know what? Bring the mirror over. I think I can learn to stand up visually. And they were like, what? And I said, well, I was a dancer. You know, we learned everything in mirrors. So it was like, well, why not? Nothing else is working. And so they had braces on both legs, and could be a walker, and they'd pick me up, and I'd stand in front of the walker, and I would look at that mirror. And I thought, okay, this is what it means to stand up. Because what happens, I've lost sensation of the right side of my body, and I've lost proprioception, which is a sense of location. So even now, 26 years later, I walk visually. So I walk peripherally, you know, look at my vision. But I don't think I could have done that if I had been a dancer. So, you know, I'm so grateful to that. I struggled to find community in this disabled body. It was pretty shocking to me from being a dancer to suddenly, you know, being paraplegic. And so I went to this conference in Los Angeles, and it was all disabled artists. And it was Los Angeles. I probably shouldn't have gone, but they were all complaining about Hollywood. Now, Hollywood won't let disabled people play disabled people, and Daniel Day-Lewis gets to play My Left Foot, and he gets an Oscar for it. And you know, and and I was like, Hollywood? Who cares about Hollywood? Hollywood does that to everybody, to women, to gays, everybody. Nobody comes out in Hollywood looking good. So I actually went back, and there were some disabled artists I admired a great deal, and so I made a video called Crip Shots. There's portraits of 6 artists with disabilities, because I felt like we had to start making our own work. You know, within a community, and maybe it would have resonance, maybe it wouldn't. I also started putting a book together that took 3 years. It was called Queer Crips, Disabled Gay Men and Their Stories, because I found there wasn't any of that. But trying to find a publisher for it was interesting, because the disability press has said, you know, we only do positive things.
Yeah.
They want to show the happy, well-adjusted, and in the disabled community you call that inspiration porn. You know, that, oh, look at that happy, well-adjusted person in the wheelchair with the van and the family, and isn't this great how well adapted they are. But this book really was about people who had depression, who were suicidal, who were horny, who, you know, it's very hard if you have a wheelchair to roll into a gay bar and be seen as like, this would be a good date tonight. So they'd hire hustlers, and you know, the complications when even a hustler would come in and look at this person and think, oh, I didn't expect this, sorry dude, and you know. But it was about people finding community, and so I thought, well, okay, the gay presses will like it. I'm like, no, this is not really for us. It's you know, if it was like buff boys and lipstick dykes, this would work, but these aren't successful people. And I thought, well, this is about finding a community. Anyway, it got published, which was great. Hayworth Press published it, and it won the Lambda Literary Award. And so, but what I'd like to do, if we could have the next slide, I made another piece that I was having a hard time reconciling my walking self, and I had a wheelchair, and it's actually easy in the wheelchair, but I don't like my wheelchair. So this was a piece I wrote after 7 years after my surgery, and it's called Dreaming Awake. I dissociate from the burning in my legs, silently crying between sleep and the morning. Hopes and dreams keep me safe through the night. After surgery, I died then, but you refused and brought me back. 7 years and counting, of tilting toward the ground. I'm afraid if I sit down, I will never get up again. The dancer in me learned to stand visually. The marathoner took the second step. Rehab gave me strength and range of motion, but with each new modality, I interrupt expectations. Improvements are not cures. If I sit down, I will never get up again. Still imagining a body I cannot have, I startle myself, glimpsing fatigue in passing windows. My bifurcated body torques with every stride. Neuropathy and weariness debilitate. Therapists caution about wear and tear, while friends cheer, you're getting better. If I sit down, I will never get up again. Navigating deadened limbs and twisted trunk, pain remains constant, dulling our life together. After a day's activities, I have no comfort left to give you. Living through chemistry, libido is gone. Holding and touching you, I long for remembered sensations. I'm afraid if I sit down, I'll never get up again. If I sit down, I'll never get up again. In this metaphorical body, I try to intercept suffering, abide in discomfort, forgive the trauma. Bearing witness, I sit with loss, move toward unobstructed feeling, and bring you along into my dreaming awake. I continued making films. Most of them were still experimental and personal, but I also did some PBS things about Genesee, which was great. A folk singer played 9 years on PBS, which was fantastic. As you know, I moved here in 2010 to run the Flynn Center, and what I love about Vermont is that political side and that artist side could be completely integrated here in Vermont. Vermont Digger ran my commentaries, the VPR ran some pieces, Vermont PBS has done a number of my pieces as well. And there wasn't a problem. I remember early on in my career, during my AIDS films, the Harvard Film Archives had a screening of my work, and I went, and I was excited about it, being in Cambridge, and thrilled to be there. And afterwards, someone raised their hand and said, "Oh, do you ever get confused with that guy with the same name that works at the Walker Art Center?" And I laughed, and I said no. I told them afterwards. I said, "I'm sorry, I'm the same person." But it was earlier on, I felt like if you were an administrator, you weren't taken as seriously if you were also an artist. Or if you're an artist, you weren't taken as seriously as an artist if you had a day job. And then what was lovely about Vermont is that it didn't, or I guess I didn't care anymore, but it also didn't matter anymore. And so I think what I'd like to do is end with a piece that I made recently with the choreographer Eiko Otake from New York, and she had just lost her mother, and we were talking about that. And my friend Jean Cross is here, and she took photos on the set, and we filmed this at Vermont PBS Studios, and it aired in 2020, and I think it just aired last month, I'm told. So anyway, it's a 9-minute piece, and then we'll answer questions if you have any.
We didn't know if you would live long enough to celebrate your 82nd birthday. My brother warned me not to be startled. You commanded no tears, even with tubes pumping fluids in and out of your tobacco-scarred body. You were beautiful, your skin translucent. You joked about ending up like a newly born, with no teeth, baby skin, and diapers. After the grandchildren sang happy birthday, they went to a barbecued rib fest, on you, of course. I stayed behind to tell you how much I admired you. Your 5 kids, disparate though we were, you celebrated each of us distinctly. I remember your reaction to my tattoo. You laughed and said, "I thought the surprises were over." As we reminisced, I thanked you for your unfettered support. You were shocked when I told you how proud I was to be your son. You hated your job as a park attendant, but kept at it long after you needed to, so as not to be a burden. Your whole life provided a future for your children, often at a high personal sacrifice. I wanted to tell you how easy it is to let go. Years ago, paralyzed and hemorrhaging from spinal surgery gone wrong, my spirit, heart, and mind imploded as morphine, fear, and pain colluded. Past and future collapsed as I drifted off into seductive, dissolving vagueness. But I awoke to Larry's pleading, "Don't die on me," and returned through his voice, eyes, and breath. I wish I could carry you safely into the void. I am well practiced, cleaning morgue bodies when I was an orderly, witnessing vultures descend upon the Himalayan sky burials, tending hungry ghosts amidst the AIDS carnage, and living through my own death. My relation to life remains porous, elusive. I fear the waiting more than dying. Saying goodbye, I had no solace to give you. All I had were tears and my own sorrow. I realized I would never see you again. You cared for so many. Who will be there when you call out, like Daddy did for you? I'm sorry I can't be there. You gave me so much. I wish you clarity and courage for a safe journey, Mom. Carry my love forward. May you find peace.
Mom, at the age of 93, you gradually stopped eating and died without any medical intervention. A good death. I'm your only child, and I have lived abroad for 46 years. I never thought I could be with you when you die. But every day for a month, I was there. You died with my cousins and me holding your hands. Staff bathed you the day before, so you smelled clean. I know you liked that. I raised your bed so you could see Mount Fuji. A spoon of ice cream was your last meal. I don't need more. Your last words. Suddenly, you opened your eyes wide. I spoke to you loudly. Mom, thank you for giving birth to me. Thank you for raising me. お母さん、産んでくれてありがとう。育ててくれてありがとう。Did you hear me? You are dressed in your favorite kimono. You had decided years earlier to wear this in your coffin. So beautiful. After I left Japan at the age of 20, you stopped eating red bean sweets for decades to wish for my safety. It is an old custom to give up a favorite food for a wish. You did not understand what drove me. For a long time, my infrequent letters were the only sign of my being alive. You must have felt very lonely. Later, phone calls changed that distance, but as your dementia advanced, you could no longer remember how to make international calls. Every day, you waited for me to reach you, and there were many days I failed. I cannot regret the way I live. You knew this all too well. You wrote, Eiko's happiness is different from my happiness. Even when you had no memory of my father, you never forgot I lived in New York, and I always had to go back to work. When we said, see you again, we both knew this could be our farewell. You never asked me to stay longer. There was a resolve in your sad smile. Mom, I inherited a lot from you and resisted a lot. I'm always going to be your daughter.
So, I'm sorry you couldn't see it. We have our echo chamber. So this was interesting for me, and I think it was during the pandemic that I was thinking about, well, you know, what are our lives and who are we in the world? And my youngest brother told me my father had given him a cassette tape. And I'd never heard the tape. But I asked my brother, well, what was the tape? And he said, well, Dad said if any of the kids ever wanted to listen to some of the stories from his life, he decided to record it. So I love that image. And so I've been blessed. I've been writing since the 90s. And so this book is 56 pieces that have been published. And it's some of my speeches, some of my commentaries, critiques of artists, and then interviews with some artists as well. And it's, I guess it's like a living archive of my experiences and my cassette tape for the world. So I'm grateful you're all here.
Thank you.
And if you have any comments or questions, please. Then of course I have books. If you want a book, and half of it's going to persons that are going to go to the library. I love libraries.
Yes. John, thank you so much for your generosity of spirit to share this with us. I'm really touched. I was very touched by the pieces that you read. I feel how genuine your willingness to share your sense of your grief, your loss. I'm just interested how when you said the number 96, it just broke my heart, I'll be honest. I can't imagine. I wasn't in that situation, so you took me there, which I appreciate. It occurs to me, listening to all the chapters of the pieces that you just shared with us, that you have found a way to absorb loss with grace and clarity. And this past year has been such a strange place of loss for all of us. And I'm just thinking about, I'm stepping back now to think about, here you are in a wholly new chapter of your life doing this. I don't know, I guess it's new. If you're an activist from age, from a teenager, maybe it's not so new. But the concept of being a legislator, like, how does this fit in, like, with where you've been and the arc that you're going on? I feel like I could listen to you talk about this for hours, but that's the question I would want to ask.
Well, yeah, thank you for what you just said. It was scary to me to leave my arts career and announce that I would be retiring from Flynn, and then deciding my next part of my life was going to be about service, and there was an opportunity to be in the Vermont House of Representatives. But to be a complete beginner after being considered an expert in something was fascinating. And to be given authority in the world and gravitas in the world and then have none, where I was just a freshman legislator, and which I didn't know anything about. In my committee work, I've been very involved in substance use disorders, recovery homes, homelessness, and I've been so profoundly blessed to have this in my life, to be encountering people that I may not have ever seen before, and to meet people without judgment. And I spent time recently at Sears Lane, which is a homeless encampment in Burlington, and the level of trauma and addiction and mental illness and physical calamity and is so enormous, and trying to help people has been incredible. I have to say that I feel I have an advantage from my artist side, because you know, as a dancer you learn, sometimes you were in the forefront, sometimes you were part of the ensemble, sometimes you were a soloist, but always like group improvisation was better. So then and so I found that in the legislature, sometimes I was leading a bill, sometimes I was the committee bill, and sometimes the chair wanted to do it, and so it always shifted, and that didn't matter. And then I mean, we only saw seconds of my film, but you know, I've made 16 films, and you storyboard the films carefully, and then you depend on your camera people, you depend on your light people, you depend on your sound people, you depend on your other artists you're working with, and it's collaborative. And you shoot it, and then when you're editing, you have to almost throw your storyboard out, because you have to work with the material you have. And sometimes you love a shot too much, and it gets in the way of the piece, so you have to kill your darlings, it's called, you know, and writing, and of course the same painters, the same artists, you know, you have to always mutate and change like that. And the bills, you start them, like right now I'm working on 5 bills that are being introduced December 1st. They will then go to different committees. The committees can choose to take them up or not. Once the committee has them, they can add any amendments they want to them. And then once that happens, they go to the floor of the House where more amendments could be sent. And then if it passes in the House, it goes to the Senate where it could be changed again. And so the idea that I have, or the things I've worked on, I had to be used to that in the collaborative nature, things change pretty dramatically. And, but I was used to that. I, for 3 years, have now worked on a recovery home bill that's had 7 iterations, and it's still in committee. And it's just like, okay, well, we'll just rehearse. It's like rehearsal. You know, when you're working on something that's good, you try to make it better. If you hit a wall in the rehearsal, you just drop it. You say, okay, it's not working, try it again. And so I think I might be less frustrated than other people with bills because of that. But I love being a beginner again, and being in a different world. It's a gift to me.
John, this was amazing to hear your stories again, and I'm wondering a little bit about how you feel about the way queer art has become very mainstream in many ways. That the work of Ron and Karen and you and others was such outsider art in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. That was amazing work and seen by very few people. And now we have Netflix and HBO and all of these places producing queer stories that are seen by millions. What is that like to see that sort of transition? And what is it, does the art feel like it's it's as relevant to queer experience if it's so commercialized. And particularly thinking of there was a Netflix show called Special about a disabled queer kid with CP.
I watched it, yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you would reflect a little bit about that transition from outsider to mainstream to commercial art.
Well, let me approach it a different way, and then I'll come back to that. But as a legislator, Outright Vermont works with queer kids across the state to find affinity. And before COVID, while we still were meeting in person, Outright Vermont brought 91 kids who are queer affinity identified. They could be just friends of, they could be LGBTQ questioning, but it was for high school kids to feel that they weren't alone. Mm-hmm. And there were 7 out legislators, and we met with these kids. But it was so many that they sat in the seats in the well of the house, and we were on the stage. And it blew my mind, because I thought, okay, this little Irish kid growing up south side of Chicago, when I said to my sister, I thought I was gay, she said, I don't know what that means. And there was no one. There was no role model. There wasn't anything like that. And I was in San Francisco in 1978 when Harvey Milk was assassinated. And he was one of the first visible gay candidates, and he was such an anomaly. So to think that in my lifetime that things could change, and there's now over 900 out queer elected officials in this country. From Harvey Milk being assassinated to over 900 is progress, but it's amazing. And part of what's important to me is that some of those youth hear some of these stories. Mm-hmm. Because when I am asked to talk at colleges and things, college kids have no idea what AIDS was like in the 80s. And now it's, chronic, manageable disease. And it's not about the disease, but the way society treated the disease. And so when I share some of that work, people are like, oh, we really didn't understand. Mm-hmm. And I don't think these 91 kids, as hard it is for their lives right now, as the teenagers, they have hard lives anyway as we try to figure ourselves out. But at least they have a community. Mm-hmm. And I felt honored that I was there to kind of show them that. So that didn't answer your question, but it did talk about the arc of history sometimes. And I think what was so vital for me in some of those artists in the 80s and 90s is that there was such a depth of desperation and survival, and that they were speaking for themselves, or they were speaking for people who didn't have voices. And so, identity politics was very potent then. It kind of didn't really last because society first didn't want it to. They got to run things out and they censored people. But also it became limiting, that you only have so much to draw from that one well, and you got to find other well to do other things. And that the special, he was great for one 30-minute thing. I thought his story is totally fascinating, and I binge watched the whole thing, and was disappointed because not everything needs to be mainstreamed. And so I think if you start making work thinking it's going to be mainstream, or you try to make mainstream work, to me it loses its power. These are just really tiny little pieces only about my life, and about my mother, but what I found is that the mother piece in particular, as it aired during COVID, it really set off people's emotions about not being able to say goodbye to their mother, sister, brother, uncle, grandma, whoever it was. about loss and stuff. And so rather than try to make a big piece, I've always tried to make little pieces, because that's, first of all, I have. And I also found that, after 3 pieces around AIDS, I'm really not sure I had any more to say, as well as disability, so I'm able to, and this has commencement addresses I've given, it's political commentaries I've given, and interviews with, Tony Kushner. So it's not really there's no through line in it. It's not like a memoir. So I like little tiny things. And that's all I have. So, but I've never mainstreamed, so I don't have to worry about it. So. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm grateful, really. I can't tell you how special this was to be like in a living room.
Yeah, it's like a
Just talking together. So,
Thank you so
and
much, John.
thank you. Thanks to the library.
Thank you for coming. I've so enjoyed everything you said, and it hit me very hard and strong like it did for you. So thank you for sharing yourself.
And thank you for filming us tonight.